So Rick, starting with quote from Goethe. We've been talking quite a bit about Goethe today. Goethe, Blake, Coleridge, Owen Barfield. And what struck me about Goethe, and I'm adding a little bit of my own contribution here, is this the need to develop new organs of perception. And I think this relates to what we've been talking about in terms of imagination, the role of imagination. And we had a quote from Blake this morning: "As you see, so it becomes. As you see, so it becomes." And this led into the Coleridge's definition of the imagination as from Malcolm Guite: a living power and the prime agent of perception. A living power and the prime agent of perception. So we've been talking about vision, imagination, the need for vision and imagination in living into new possibilities for the future. Then we've spent a bit of time talking about Owen Barfield's own scheme of original participation, then alienation, individualization, and then final participation in freedom. And I would compare that with the Gnostic view of being able to understand that we are the whole, not just we're part of the whole, we are the whole. Another idea that came up this morning, which is an important one from an evolutionary point of view, is Marilyn Monk talking about the lower or less developed or evolutionary elements being in service to the whole looking after the parts, and the parts being in service to the whole, from which she derives, and I can't give you the full argument, that God is love, but it's worked up from the bottom, but it also comes down from the top. Then another theme I wanted to mention, which again is something we might want to elaborate on a little bit, and people haven't mentioned this today. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Abolition of Man, and of course it would not be called The Abolition of Man any longer. There's another man called Michael A. Schliemann who's written The Restitution of Man, and by man there is meant the human, of course. But the point is that the abolition of the human is the reduction of quality to quantity. The transmutation or the seeing of I as it, interpreting not from the first person but from the third person, from the outer. And I think we've been reaffirming the importance of the quality, the subject, consciousness, the inner. And then we've been going from, this is another set of phrases that have been used, the original connectedness going to disconnected and alienation, or disorientation, and then going to reconnect, but reconnect is also interconnect. And it's this sense of interconnectedness and belonging that we are striving to bring into being. Then we've also been talking about reason enfolded in the imagination. So not separating reason from imagination, not separating the left from the right hemisphere in Ian McGilchrist's language, but integrating those. And my thought on this is that the other faculty that we have is the higher nous, the higher intellect. This used to be called intellect. And intellect means literally to read between, interlegory. But in my view, the nous, or the intellect, is what enables us to grasp the whole. Grasp the whole. Not analyze the parts, but grasp the whole. And it's this sort of perception that we need, this perception of wholeness, if we're going to be able to take ourselves forward. And then, before segueing into the question and what you have to say, I'd like to make one other point which hasn't been raised today, and this is a whole tradition of new thought. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the American Transcendentalists, the New Thought movement of the late 19th century, Ralph Waldo Trine, Thomas Troward, Charles Harnell. But it was Thomas Troward I was put in mind of, because he has this language of of the center, of being aware of ourselves as centers. And what we can say as a center is, I am. And what Troward wonderfully, in my view, says, and you'll see why this is significant, he says, what can say I am in me or in you is the same as what can say or is saying I am in the other, in all of us, in other words. So when we say I am, we're at the same time asserting our own presence as a center, but the center, the deep center in us is also saying I am. So it's the two I ams coming together. We've talked a lot this afternoon about transformation, formation and transformation. Formation in terms of education, transformation in terms of renewal, but also in terms of death and rebirth. And this is where I'd like to bring you in, because we've got this disorientation and a reorientation going on. And we've got a lot of fear, but at the same time, there's a certain trust in the overall cosmic process. And I know some people would say, well, we all volunteered to be here at this very exciting time. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we might use the language of phase transition. This came up in our table. And the phase transition, one way of looking at this is it's a breakdown before there's a breakthrough. So to what extent are both these processes going on, the breakdown and the breakthrough? And more specifically, and you can see why this relates to question 3, or theme 3, Rick, are we, I'm using your words now, are we entering a perilous initiatic journey, a rite of passage, a descent into the underworld, a process of individuation, a planetary near-death experience, a dark night of the soul? So I know this is your sort of diagnosis, as it were, which I think many of us here share. So maybe you'd like to take us through that as one of the major themes of your current work.
Thank you, David. And let me just ask, how is my technical, how's the communication coming through? Can you hear me all right? Yes. Oh, good. All right. Thank you. Well, thank you for welcoming me from afar, California. I feel a little bit embarrassed to be joining such an erudite conference while everyone has been producing such wonderful thoughts and dialogue, and it happens to coincide with my sleeping hours from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. And so I generally love to be at a conference engaging people in real time and in hearing what everyone has to say, so that my own participation has is in dialogue in relevance. What David has just shared with me here, and of course I have some long familiarity with the works of a number of the people who have been presenting here. Gary, I've known for many years, Gary Lockman, and I know Jules and a couple people weren't able to make it, but I know Mark's work, and it's just great to be joining in with you today. So thank you for inviting me and tolerating this long distance mode of communication. So everything that you've just outlined there, David, is such a, it approaches from these different themes, different angles, an overall gestalt that is one that I both can feel is shared there. Each person may be emphasizing one thing or another, but it's very much part of a interrelated whole. And I think any of you who may know some of my work know how much I am a kindred spirit amongst you in all those regards. Now, I think what some of the thrust of the discussion has brought up here is this paradox between, on the one hand, there's a profound trust that people who have gone through some deep spiritually transformational experience, who have, that often has intellectual, emotional, relational dimensions, somatic, etc., imaginative, and that opening can give one such a deep sense of trust in the larger cosmic process, as being ensouled, as being that there's a divine telos, a teleological unfolding that has more, gives us more sense of profound security than any insurance policy can in the everyday world. It gives us a sense of being deeply grounded. And at the same time, we cannot help but see the extremity of the crisis of our Earth community and of the human community and the states of our various nations. My own being a fairly horrific case in point. And I guess the UK and the US are undergoing some pretty chaotic events and personages and conflicts. And above all, the whole sense that our civilization has this most brilliant civilization in so many ways, and this most brilliant species, Homo sapiens, that it could have produced such a cataclysmic reality for the Earth community, where we're basically kind of crashing the Cenozoic era, and it's on our watch. It's our responsibility. All these bring to mind certain paradoxes about, on the one hand, here's all the brilliance, and even a moral sensitivity that has continued to evolve over the centuries, and is visible today in the opening up to the recognition of all the dignity of all forms of human being, and the dignity of all beings in ways that is more large progressive elements in society are taking on that greater sort of moral discernment and conscientiousness and the empathic circle of our heart. That all those are such positive developments, and yet we're dealing with this paradox of a catastrophic ecological situation and social political at this point. And then the spiritual paradox that I started out with, just saying, well, what, on the one hand, we have this trust in the cosmic process, in the divine telos, and at the same time, there's great uncertainty, there's great anxiety in the land, and often the people who have this spiritual discernment and a certain security in that way are also those who are often most alert to what we need to be anxious about. They're not drowning, they're not in denial about the state of the earth. They're not just watching movies and video games and avoiding the what's going on in the Arctic, in the ocean, to our fishes, to our soil, and so forth. So all these things, when I look at the remarkable number of major characteristics or features of our time, I can't help but think about how these are almost perfectly paralleled in what one goes through in a range of profound initiatory rites of passage, where there is virtually always most of these elements. First of all, a great sense of kind of groping in the darkness and uncertainty about the future, with a sense of encroaching danger. There is often a deep sense of estrangement or alienation that is both metaphysical and emotional, relational. There is also very typically a strong deconstruction of our old identity. Our whole sense of who we are, it goes through a kind of ego death, a dissolution. There's often accompanying all this elements of the dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross described it. And there is also a strong sense of a descent, that we're going through a descent into the underworld. Many of the characteristics that, say, Stan Groff described of spiritual emergencies and of the perinatal process, the death-rebirth process, are captured in some of the things that I'm saying here, and also of Jung's individuation process. There's regularly there's also an encounter with mortality, and here the mortality is being registered on the planetary level. It's not only just our personal mortality. In some sense, those of us who are 70 years old, 80 years old, even in our 60s, we've come to deal with our own individual mortality. But for millennia, that mortality of the individual was embedded in a sense of the ongoing nature of future generations and of the earth, and that the trees and the birds were still going to be here. And suddenly we're having to face a kind of mass extinction in which mortality takes on a global quality. So when you combine that with a sense of spiritual, disorientation that is so widespread, the sense of being decentered, which of course classically gets set in motion with Copernicus, and then Darwin brings in another level, and then Freud brings in another level, and Nietzsche, and all the decenterings and kind of dethroning of a previously higher status. Those are also familiar to us. Maybe finally I'll mention the questioning of what is real. I don't know if you have the same problem there, but there's in the UK, but the quality of like with the news, like fake news and disinformation campaigns, and leaders just frankly obliterating any sense of integrity towards the truth. And they're very typically in the individual spiritual emergency or perinatal process, there can be a feeling that one might be losing one's sanity. Jung describes it in his red book, Descent. And actually many of the qualities that I've just described are very much features of the descent that Jung described in the red book. So in all these ways, it seems to me that it's as if if we could understand this multi-dimensional crisis of meaning and identity and mortality and so forth, facing our own fallibility and finitude, our responsibility for what our shadows, where things have gone wrong, all these we can recognize as being essential aspects of an initiatory process. And those of us, and I suspect it's most people in the room with whom I'm speaking here, have had experiences in which they've gone through a kind of ego death and a reawakening to a deeper spiritual engagement with life, and they can recognize that what they went through is in some sense being writ large in the human community and Earth community as a whole right now.
Rick, can I just come in there?
Please do.
In Cosmos and Psyche, you do discuss historical parallels with our time on the basis of archetypal astrology. And I just wondered whether you might say a few words about how you see this unfolding in the next 2-3 years, because I know you had various analyses of this. And what's your latest take?
Well, I wasn't sure how many of my everyone there. I know many of my friends are there who are astrologically initiated, but I wasn't sure how many. So how much I could depend on the basic grasp of. Certainly we all understand that we live in an ensouled universe. It's archetypally informed, and the nobler astrological tradition that we inherit, out of, it goes back to of course, the Egyptians and Mesopotamians in particular, but through Plato and Kepler and right up to our own time in the integration of depth psychology, archetypal studies, and so forth. We can recognize, those who have studied this carefully can see that there is an astonishing correlation between the great planetary cycles and the archetypal dominant complexes or principles that seem to get constellated at different times of history. And we have, for example, for the last decade, been going through a very powerful planetary alignment, the Uranus-Pluto cycle. The last time they were in conjunction was the 1960s to the early 70s. And again, we have many of the most, the tremendous amount of protests, the disruptive impulse to transform the world, revolutionary movements that can both tend towards violence, but also towards great kind of utopian power. The problem is that this has the same alignment. The one before that was square in the 1930s, and we see in many ways a lot of what this last decade has been a kind of tension between, let's say, the more positive dimensions of the 60s and the more problematic dimensions of the 30s. The activation of the collective id, the mob energy, that kind of fascist, xenophobic, what Jung called the possession state by Wotan of the German people, for example, in the 1930s. We can recognize a lot of this, both sides now coming through so much. French Revolution, of course, had both of those going on, and that was another one of these Uranus-Pluto decades. So that's been happening, but right now we are in the middle of a shorter 4-year conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which brings in quite a bit of gravitas, a very stern encounter with the reality principle, with limits, endings of things. It can make things often come to a head. There's all sorts of expressions like it's when the rubber meets the road. It's when the chickens come home to roost. It's when the screws tighten. It tends to bring events at the very best. It tends to constellate a profound sense of moral gravitas in which large numbers of people feel the sense of such historical significance and moral gravity that it has intruded itself on our time, and they shoulder that, and it can constellate a certain for the right people a certain moral courage to meet an extremely challenging time, and but at the same time those challenges tend to be much more evident than usual. often there's major crises. 9/11 was the last Saturn-Pluto opposition. Major wars. I won't go all through. Both world wars began under Saturn-Pluto hard aspects. The Cold War as well. It's a very challenging alignment, but it also tends to be like the death throes of an old era, and potentially also the birth labor of a new one, with all that seriousness that the mother brings into the birth of a child, with the entire body and soul, as it were, gripped with an overpowering force to give birth to this new being. All of creation groaneth in travail for the birth of this being. I see, in some sense, we are in the birth throes of a new mode of being. And maybe I'll tie this back to if you don't mind me saying one more thing, and then I'll give it back to you, David. If I can tie this back to my earlier point about the initiatory process, we are, as with any birth, so also with any rite of passage or initiation, and that is uncertainty is a critical part of it. In fact, in an initiatory process, if you don't have a sense that everything's on the line and that there really is an uncertainty about the outcome, there can be no profound moral transformation or spiritual reconfiguration of your deep being. It can't be like a kind of pretend near-death experience for it to work. It's not like something that you can just kind of act out in a weekend workshop. It has to really count. You have to feel like your entire, like everything is at stake. And we all know how all the research about how near-death experiences, there's hardly anything that compares to that for really bringing about a moral transfiguration of a person's life as to what's valuable. I think humanity as a whole is undergoing this. Now the question is, what in tribal societies, initiations are overseen by elders who kind of are governing the whole thing, and the initiates, like whether they're young people moving into adulthood or whatever is the form, they are separated out from the tribe, from the mothers, from the community. But we, modern Homo sapiens, has separated itself out from the entire community of being, the universal ensouled life of the whole, the anima mundi. And that's been through our whole tremendous intellectual development over the last, several hundred and really even several thousand years, with the result that we have participated unconsciously, in some sense, in creating an initiatory crisis. We have separated ourselves from the whole and are now in that state of alienation. But in the act of that separation, we have forged a certain moral, rational autonomy, an imaginative autonomy, that can allow us to co-creatively participate in the unfolding of whatever is our next stage of evolution, if we rise to the occasion. And it's going to take tremendous courage. I think it takes heroic communities as well. As you know, I've spoken to the network about this in London at other times, about the importance of heroic communities. We can't do this on our own. We really need to, it takes communities to sustain the act of the intellectual and cosmological and moral imagination to bring about this kind of transformation. We need to hold space for each other to go through the transformations that are necessary for such a participative re-engagement with our world soul. Those are a few ideas.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to bring in three other possible angles here. One is the work of David Hawkins. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. One of his initial books is called Power versus Force. and there's an extraordinary one called I, which I reviewed a couple of years ago. But I wanted to focus in on power versus force. Force is violence, and violence always produces its own compensating opposite, whereas force is inner power, it's spiritual authority, and that helps. It seems to me this is part of what we need to develop in remaining very centered in ourselves. And maybe I'll leave the other 2 points for a moment, but you can just maybe like to do a sort of brief response, because I think we're all looking to each other for guidance here. You know, how are we meant to be? How can we best be? And what can we best do? How can we best feel? You know, what is the what's your own what are your own thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like that distinction. The will to power can get a very bad name if it's well,
that's what he calls force, you see.
Mistaken with force. Now, the kind of power that I think you're referring to there, and Hawken is referring to, which has to do, it's a kind of creative power that is grounded in the cosmos itself, and we are vessels of it.
Yeah.
We're also, but we're embedded, but we're autonomous vessels of it. So we play a role. We have a responsible role in how that powerful energy expresses itself and is brought into the world. And then the question becomes, how you brought in all these things that we today in this room and myself, what we are looking for as individuals. How can we live better, more imaginatively, more with more power in this sense? And I think what it involves is, part of the postmodern development. I mean, so much of the postmodern, I believe, is very actually noble. I mean, the importance of embracing the multiplicity of life and not always going for the unitive, the unitary, which can become hierarchical and oppressive. That opening up to the tremendous multiplicity of ways of being, of people, etc. That's important. But if everybody's in their separate potted plants, rather than rooted in the earth, then we get into all sorts of relativistic and nihilistic consequences. And so I think if we can, the way to get out of the potted plant separate, kind of linguistic community, postmodern deconstructive view, and into a participation in the larger whole that is in touch with the great power that you're talking about here, that involves going through a dying to the ego of the potted plant, as it were.
It needs a transplant, in other words. It needs a transplant into a larger pot, or maybe out of the pot into the earth.
Yes, and which involves a shattering of the pot, and a kind of
but the pot is also a constriction, isn't it? It's a limit, and so it's expanding out of that. I think that's a rather nice analogy. Can I just bring in another point here? But I'll just roll these 2 points together. We heard recently from Betty Kovacs. I don't know whether you know her work. She's works on death, but also her new book called Merchants of Light is partly about bringing the help of and support of other realms of being into the mix. In other words, Sir George Trevelyan always used to say, the angels can't help unless you ask them. And so if we as humanity, we're sort of in the rapids here, just changing the analogy, meltdown rapids, whichever way you want to do it. So one thing is asking for this, or tuning into this other help of beings who long for our rebirth and transformation. Now, a practical way that this kind of power of prayer and silence was used. You may know or may not know this was the silent minute in the Second World War. And this was initiated by an initiate called Wellesley Tudor Pole, who had contacts at the absolute highest level. And he introduced this idea of everybody falling silent at 9 o'clock when Big Ben went off. And apparently there's a German high command after the war. They said you must have had some kind of, there must have been a secret weapon, inverted commas, weapon of love, of course. And so a few of us a few years ago, and maybe the time for this is ripening. I don't know whether Janice is still in the room, because she is, but Janice Dolly, we developed this a bit together, was the heart of light. And so our idea was that everybody at 9 o'clock in their time zone in the evening would light a candle. And the reason it's called a heart of light is that there's a beautiful item I got in Sweden, which was a crystal heart, and then you put a tea light in it. And you can actually get them sort of not that, it won't be as beautiful, but you can actually get these kind of things in on Amazon or whatever. Won't be as beautiful. But I mean, maybe we ought to come together in this kind of spiritual initiative as well, as part of the way that, we're lighting a candle in the darkness. And that's the Chinese proverb, as I'm sure you know. Do not curse the darkness, but rather light a candle.
Indeed. Yes. That sounds like a very effective, well, already has proved itself a very effective ritual. And God knows how much our contemporary society needs vital sacred rituals which the loss of rituals of transformation of adequate depth is, I think, a great part of our crisis, because that means that all the adolescent energy that hasn't gone through the initiation into responsible adulthood means that the world's being run by a kind of uninitiated adolescent energy. And yeah, we really do need rituals. And that sounds like a very effective one. I might also add that the advantage of going through this dissolving of what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, so that our sense of identity encompasses a much larger whole. That seems to me, when we go into ourselves to find out, well, how can I personally contribute to the whole? I think the clues we get for how to do that, they come from these inner promptings as to where I feel most alive, where one learns to kind of, it's like, I don't know, surfing or sailing or something through life, where you have to kind of trust, get a sense for where the wind is pulling you, and use your own intelligence and knowledge, memory, but you also are constantly attending to these inner promptings in your depths that can come in special moments, and that can connect us to. I mean, I think that's basically these other dimensions or beings, angelic or ancestral. Those who've gone on before us, who could be kind of giving us clues to the next thing that we might be doing that could be most useful. I very much trust that kind. Actually, I do a ritual like that before I start my day's work, which is to just open my mind and my heart to the angels and muses, the ancestors and spirits, the gods and goddesses, heaven and earth, and that which is overseeing and informs all things. That act, as you say, Sir George Trevelyan said, we need to invite that kind of participation, and that's a small part of our own.
Maybe also just kind of offer ourselves in service.
Yes, beautiful.
There's a passage in the second book of Lars Muhl's O manuscript, which some of you may know, when it says how rare it is, that the seer says how rare it is that there are humans who kind of make themselves available for higher purposes. And then there's plenty of work to do, as we all know, in that sense. Rick, I think we'll just expand the dialogue
Please.
a bit now. You have a...
Yeah, so the idea would be to move into the last half hour or so, and if the speakers would like to join us on the stage, then we might see what reflections come up, and Rick can stay with us as well. And pick up some threads, I guess, try and see from the group as a whole. So exactly. if the speakers would like to come up, that'd be great.
Great. Well, while that's happening, can I thank you very much, Rick, for your wise counsel and for being with us. And we really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm humbled to be asked to join you in this way, and thank you for accepting my long-distance participation.
Shall I stay here?
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Marilyn's coming as well. Share this.
Sorry? The reality principle. Can you say something about that?
Yes. That's a term out of psychoanalysis that Freud gave, that the ego is constantly navigating its way through life by, on the one hand, trying to satisfy our passions, our instincts, our biological and emotional needs, but it's also in touch with the reality principle, namely that which will produce effects on, depending on our actions, that there'll be consequences. And so if a person just lives out their instinctual promptings without any filter or inhibition, and without any sense of what the environment might, how it might react, there'll be pretty destructive consequences. So the reality principle is, I think one philosopher said, it's what's there, whether or not we think it's there, or despite all our attempts to ignore it.
So it's also what the Greeks called hubris and nemesis.
Yes, the reality principle definitely kicks in the face of hubris and inflation.
Thank you very much. If you've got any final thoughts, then we can throw them in and then pick up final thoughts from the audience as well, I guess. I mean, just listening to Rick and David there and musing a bit on the day as we come to the end of it, it struck me we've been probably quite a diverse group here today, but with this sense, which was articulated actually, particularly when the four figures were up in the morning, about, on the one hand, service, as Marilyn put it, how the parts are in the service of the whole. And then I think Malcolm talked about a kind of humility, and Jessica too, that releases the ego actually and frees the individual self to become co-worker, which Rick was mentioning there, this sense that this is part of our calling, which you find in different spiritual traditions. And that feels a hopeful note that there is, that's been in the air here even today, I think, that sense of being in service to the greater whole. And then I think that links to something which is rather wonderful, which is a sense of freedom. It actually frees you up. And from Barfield, Steiner, and others, this idea that freedom is a good kind of compass for all this. To use the phrase that's in the Gospels for Jesus, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I think that that's really crucial, that even in the struggle and the darkness, this sense that if we're stepping into a lighter space where we feel there's more movement perhaps, maybe there's more love. It's not that there's no sorrow or weeping, but the sorrow and weeping can happen and it can move, it doesn't get stuck. The psychotherapist in me wants to say, it's not that you don't feel anything anymore, but you're able to keep moving in a kind of freedom for all these different feelings. You don't get caught in a kind of rigidity, which can become neurotic and so on. So that sense of freedom for me has been around. Also, just what was being said there, this business of sort of following the energy without trying to pin it down too quickly. I think this is a big theme in Barfield. When he talks about parables, for example, and also about poetry, he's saying very much kind of let it work on you. And this is part of this reorientation to picking up on the spiritual beings, calling them, having an open mind and heart. And learning to do that a lot more feels really, really important to me. And I think part of that is about realizing that we're engaged fundamentally in a spiritual transformation. Certainly in the Christian world that I know anyway, it can often get reduced too quickly to a kind of set of moral demands, as if we've got to try and fix things. We've got to, as it were, make a difference now. And the point about things like justice and so on is there's nothing wrong with them, of course not. But if we're not careful, it becomes a kind of spiritual materialism, I think. And when we're actually following an agenda of this world, rather than trying to keep at least half of us open to this deeper spiritual transformation, which can bring in another world. So I feel that that's been sort of hovering around the edges for me in the last few minutes. And just a final extra thought there. I'm very keen on the work of Jeffrey Kripal, the American psychologist. And I think one of his key insights is that when we're engaging with this spiritual world, whether it's through paranormal experiences, maybe through astrology, the various ways that can happen to us, he says it's always reflexive. There's always a kind of discernment that's required. We mustn't get literal and concrete about it. We must understand that actually the truth of these experiences comes up in the third space that happens between us and the experience, or between us and the interpretation, between us and the movement. Because it's, and this is not just because we're engaging with things we don't fully understand, but it's because this very movement is trying to take us into a different experience of reality, a different level of things. It is a spiritual transformation. So we should always expect that we have to do the work of interpretation, the hermeneutical work, to use an old-fashioned term, because that is what it itself lifts us. This is the transcendent function of Jung, this reflexive idea, to work on that as well. So just a few thoughts to pick up some more. Anyone else would like to add anything? Or maybe we can, yeah.
I just want to touch on this notion of the reality principle that Rick just mentioned, and then earlier in his talk there, he said that he didn't know what it was like here, but he knew in the States that reality was in danger. And I have to say that struck me very close to home, because I've written a book, I think, about what Rick was talking about the situation in the States with the world of alternative facts and post-truth. And not to name names, but I think the most recently elected president of the United States, there's this thing called the singularity that people have been waiting for a long time. And in physics, astrophysics, singularity is the black hole, where everything is different. Once you get to the black hole, the laws of physics change. They break down, they're not the same. And then in kind of New Age kind of philosophy, there's this notion down the line, historically, something's going to happen that's a singularity, and everything's going to be different. There's going to be a big neon sign coming up over the horizon saying New Age has arrived. But I think when this most recent presidential election in the United States was over, the singularity had arrived. I think it had come because everything was different after that. And it really made me feel that reality was threatened. Reality was under attack by forces that have taken ideas about the notion that reality
is kind of malleable, that imagination can affect reality. I mean, we all sort of didn't like the idea that, okay, science tells us this is real and that's it, there's nothing you can do, the imagination is just in your head and it doesn't have no effect on the outer world out there. But then we've had for several years now, from different sources, starting say with quantum physics, with the whole idea of the observer and the observed, that there's no separation between the two, and you observe something, you're affecting it. And then in the academic world with things like postmodernism and deconstructionism, there is no truth with a big capital T, and there's no reality with a big R. And then even in sort of the esoteric world, where we did want to somehow have some effect on reality. Well, I think all that has come home to roost, as Rick said, but not in a way that we wanted it to. And in a way, like, I think we have to protect reality now. We have to really get a grasp on the things that are real and important, and have a strong kind of sense of defense for them, because there are people out there who have dubious purposes, and they are quite ready to go for it. So reality's up for grabs. There's no reality with a capital R. There's no truth with a capital T. We all create our own reality. Fine, I'm going to go for it. So I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. And reality is something that's malleable, and it does change over time. And we said earlier that the imagination has something to do with that. And the more we become aware of that, the more we become aware of our own responsibility in that action that's taking place now. So, I mean, in a simple kind of sense, I would say, make sure what's going on inside your head is what you want to go on inside your head, and not leave it. I mean, it's good to have an open mind, but if you keep it open too much, too many things you don't want will walk in, and they'll squat. They'll take up residency there. So I think you have to be very careful about that. And if one thing to walk away from this today, which is, to me, it's incredibly encouraging that we had so much time here and so many people interested in this, that we can take seriously the whole idea of making sure we're the one furnishing that inner world.
I just wanted to say something fairly brief, which is, I mean, I very much heard what somebody said about does anybody else here feel embarrassed to talk about this stuff out in the real world, as it were? I mean, do you feel unable to talk in the way that we've talked here? And I think many of us do. I know I do. I find it, very intimidating. And so I tend not to do it. So I think that I want to really just reflect how important it is that this group here, this large group here, has felt able to talk in such an open and understanding way with such a diversity of experience that is also so common. I think we really should not ignore how important that is to everything that we've been just talking about, actually. The importance of the imagination, the importance of, right behavior, acting together. Here we are. It has been an amazing day, but in the sense that there's no time and no space, this is a group that can continue outside this room with the memory of what happened today, and that is, I think, a very powerful imaginative intention to take forward. So I'd like to do that.
Yeah, I was going back to what you were just saying last about we have to be careful about, what we let in as well. And I'm not against at all appealing to spiritual beings in the invisible. But I think there is also in that invisible potentially spiritual beings that are not necessarily benign. And just because it's the invisible and the unknown doesn't mean that there is a resource there that we don't have to be discerning about. But I'm not against if people feel that's something they should be doing. But I would, at the same time, suggest there is caution required.
Can I just respond to that briefly? Is that, there's a whole tradition dealing with precisely that. Barfield was very concerned about what the products of undisciplined imagination would create. And Madame Blavatsky got into a lot of trouble with the spiritualist community because she said at the seances, the entities that you're getting in touch with, it's not Aunt Betty and it's not Napoleon. It's the equivalent of astral hobos who have nothing better to do, and they're waiting for anybody to get in touch with them, and they'll tell you whatever you want to hear, and they'll communicate and tell you anything you want because that's what they want. They want to maintain the contact with the physical world, and there's a whole tradition of this, and this is something Henri Corbin, I mentioned him earlier, the great French phenomenologist and scholar of Persian mysticism. He too said, like, imagination is the key. The imagination is a precise tool with which we can chart and navigate our way through a precise mode of reality, but we have to have a disciplined imagination. And he looked to the Hermetic tradition and other spiritual traditions who provided a kind of guidebook, a sort of thing like that. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to be careful about that. And the other thing is the spiritual powers are pretty tough. I mean, I don't know if you know Rilke's poem, the Duino Elegies. In the beginning of the poems, he says, who if I cried and the angelic orders would hear me? And when they finally do hear him, he says, every angel is terrible. Beauty is the beginning of a terror that we're just able to bear. So, it's nice to have all the lovely little paintings and New Age drawings of angels, and they're all fluffy and they're very friendly and all that. But they're powerful, powerful forces, and we really have to, be careful, as you said, in dealing with them. You have to devise some way to be able to discern good from the bad, or the helpful from the ones that aren't helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to bring some hope into this. I know I'm just a speck of dust, but I believe there is a reality. There is a real reality that we can all rely on, call it eternity, call it the eternal. There is a greater truth that I don't think changes, which is bigger than all of us. And I believe that when we come to pass over, to die, that, a lot of it makes sense. So I just want to come back to the here and now. And yes, I think society is largely socially constructed anyway. I'm doing family history and I'm dwelling in the Holocaust. That was absolute madness, what went on. You could feel the same in America right now. It's complete madness. But the point is, it's all there to test you. It's about character development, and you've got to stick to your own sense of righteousness and what's right. So, for instance, going back to the Holocaust, there were righteous people who took in refugees, who took in, and there was those who were in the resistance. You can look at positive and inspirational, and I think today we've got Extinction Rebellion and all this going on. So I think we have choices, unlimited choices, to continue on our own path of goodness. I do feel be careful of being cynical and upset. If you go back to the spiritual forces, yes, I completely agree. There's goodness, but there is definitely evil, if you like, dark forces. And be careful with spirituality. Be careful with, seances and all this business, paranormal. Just be really careful. I would rather go to a church and pray to God and praise and goodness and become stronger with positivity and goodness and service, as Marilyn said, serving the whole, rather than looking for something exciting and titillating, because you could be led astray without realizing it. And anyway, to come back, so I feel that we're living in interesting times and so on, but it's a chance for a paradigm shift, and don't lose hope, because there's a bigger picture and it's all perfect.
In your Passion of the Western Mind, you spoke about, philosophically, about participation, which is such a wonderful direction in which we're going as a society, perhaps, but it certainly opened our talk today on that. You don't say an awful lot about it, and it'd be very nice to know what you think about its sort of recent history in modern philosophy, where it's going, because if one can persuade the Academy that this is philosophically sound, that would be a very good basis for a much more positive society, I think. So I'd be interested in your philosophical views on participation, consciousness.
Yes, thank you. When I remember when I was writing the epilogue to Passion of the Western Mind, which was originally a paper in Cambridge University there, a conference called Philosophy and the Human Future. And I was just looking for a single term to describe I was particularly focused on the epistemological challenges of the postmodern time, and then went to the idea of a participatory epistemology. It was back in '89, drawing on the work of many of the people that you've been speaking of here today, Goethe and Steiner, Barfield, Emerson, and so forth. And it's been quite remarkable how participation, with its very multivalent, very richly multiple ways in which it can be understood and unpacked, how much participation has become more and more discussed in the public intellectual world and in the, particularly, of course, the countercultural intelligentsia, of which I would say places like the Scientific and Medical Network, communities like that, Schumacher, CIIS, Esalen Institute, places that we are there and here are very much part of. It's become central. I think, and there have been books on the participatory turn, for example, is a very good anthology that was of scholarly essays that the State University of New York Press published. It was edited by Jorge Ferrer and Jacob Sherman, with many excellent contributions. So participation is becoming more discussed, and I think it's almost the inevitable, if I can use the term, kind of dialectical fulfillment of where postmodernity is going. Depending on how I prefer to describe the postmodern in a more embracing sense that includes its nobility as well as that shadow side of kind of deconstructive fragmentation and nihilism with which we can ease it. In a kind of underlying rigid materialism that occludes a lot of the metaphysical possibilities. That's true. That is part of the postmodern, and it has been dominant in the academic world. But I certainly see there's been evolving a shift in the wind. It never goes as fast as any of us want it to, and the fact of the matter is we need it to go much faster given the acceleration of evolutionary and historical crisis in our time. But it's often the crisis that produces the acceleration of change that is needed. And again, I have a certain faith in, I don't know on what time scale that this will take place, but participation which simultaneously recognizes the kind of like the breakthroughs of the formation of the modern self in its rational moral autonomy, which in some sense was an interjection of the divine transcendent that it inherited out of Christianity and Judaism. That great painting of Michelangelo's creation moment on the Sistine Chapel, it's so iconic in part because that is the moment in which, whether it's in the scientific revolution that's unfolding right at that moment with Copernicus, or in the painters themselves, or in the new religious autonomy that's bursting at the seams there with the Protestant Reformation, it captures the moment in which there's a divine human transmission with all the potential danger of the inflation and the hubris of the modern. And the beauty of participation is that it takes that positive gift of the modern, I would call it the internalization of the axial breakthrough that takes place in the modern period. It takes that and it breaks it out of the alienation that the hubristic side of the modern anthropocentric disenchanting project carried. It breaks it out of it, and it allows us to participate back into the anima mundi, but with our agency intact, and all the discernment, which I couldn't catch everything that many people were talking about because the microphones aren't, it isn't picked up on the computer. I could only catch some of it, but some of what I heard seemed to be talking about the extraordinary importance of discernment when it comes to opening ourselves to the spiritual domain and various spiritual beings. It takes tremendous discernment, and there's nothing, the same good and evil that exists in the human sphere is also true in the spiritual sphere. And so that's why our moral autonomy and our discernment, our capacity for clarity of discernment is so crucial in this participatory act that is necessary. So anyway, those are a couple of themes. I do see participation becoming more and more central. It's part of people in like Peter Reason have been developing it for years there in the UK in the area of inquiry and the social sciences, and I think it's an inevitable intellectual development that it'll be inevitably stronger and stronger.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I mean, that was actually a very nice summary that took me back to some of the things which you were saying right at the top of the day. So that was lovely to hear, actually. Thank you for the question and then those thoughts. But maybe we'll push towards the end now, David, because we're approaching 6 o'clock, if not there already.
Yes. Well, I'd just like to say a few thanks for the day, people who made this day possible. First of all, to the Fetzer Institute, and we have Mohammed here flew in this morning. I'm so pleased you were able to be here. And if you've looked at the leaflet that we gave you on the Fetzer Institute, it's all about helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Isn't that what we've been doing today as part of our? We haven't mentioned love enormously, but it's been infused, if you like, I think, in a lot of what we've been saying. So when everyone feels a sacred sense of connection to themselves, to each other, and our planet, I think that's beautifully expressed. And you can sign up for their newsletter by going to fetzer.org. So big thanks to the Fetzer Foundation.